Mr. Canavan, just a handful of further questions. Dealing, first of all, with the ACVSB and their consideration of the costs implications associated with HCV screening. Your evidence earlier was to the effect that the ACVSB wouldn't be blind to the costs associated with HCV screening, but that it would be for the department to form its own view. And your statement details the various attempts made with Mr. Anderson and others to consider costs. What about the departments in Wales, Northern Ireland and Scotland? Were they able to take a view on costs and make any submissions or representations on that issue?
Well, no doubt they could have made representations to finance, because they would end up bearing a share of costs. But I cannot recollect that they ever made any such representations.
Next question, still sticking with the ACVSB. We explored earlier the decision-making in 1991, which resulted in the suggestion that there should be essentially an assessment of the second generation tests as well as the first generation tests. Now, the question I'm asked to ask you is this. I'm not sure whether it's something you'll be able to answer, but I'll try. Did the ACVSB's deliberations and recommendations have the effect of validating the second generation HCV test for diagnostic as well as screening purposes?
I'm sorry, I don't know that.
Okay, that's fair enough. I asked you earlier about who decided when a minister needed to be notified of matters relating to the ACVSB decision-making, and you said it was Dr. Metters who would make known when he wanted a submission or briefing prepared for ministers. However, would it have been open to you, or indeed your colleagues, to take the initiative and decide that something really needed to go to ministers?
We would have discussed that issue with Dr. Metters first to see if he agreed.
And if he said no, I appreciate this, I think it's probably hypothetical. Did this ever arise?
Didn't ever arise, no.
And is that because you agreed with his assessment of when ministers needed to be notified, or is that because you didn't apply your own mind to it independently?
No, I think as a very good chairman, we were content to go along with his view on it. He was politically astute, and he would know when things were sufficiently sensitive to require putting ministers in the picture.
Now, I asked you about how you would ascertain what existing policies there were, or what existing lines to take there were, and you told us how you would look at the policy files to see what the line had been, or what the policy development had been. This is a general question in relation to that process. When you did so, would you look at the policies or lines to take that you found on the files with a critical eye, an assessing eye, and ask yourself, is this what I should still be putting forward? Or was it very much more of a rubber stamping exercise? Well, that's the existing line, that's what I'll repeat.
No, had to look at it with a critical eye, because things might have moved on.
So would that, do you think, be the responsibility of any civil servant in the kind of position and level of seniority that you were at?
Yes.
The last area of questioning is in relation to communications with other countries about HCV testing. I asked you whether you had, or your colleagues made contact with officials in other countries to see what they were doing. Do you know whether any other countries made contact with the department to find out what was happening in the United Kingdom?
I don't recall any such contact. But members of the ACBSB were attending international conferences, which no doubt provided an opportunity for information exchange.
And if one leaves aside those opportunities that you've just described, and certainly there are examples in the ACBSB papers of that, and of Dr. Gunson attending conferences and the like, but leaving that aside, in terms of the department, were there any systems of communication or interaction generally between the department and European countries or the USA about developments in virological safety?
I can't speak for what the Medicines Control Agency, what arrangements they may have had in liaising with other regulatory departments in other countries. But for my own section in policy, no, there was no routine exchanges.
And then you told us earlier in response to a question that you and your colleagues didn't, to your knowledge, ask other European countries what they were doing or find out how their introduction of screening was working. Why was that the case?
Well, I don't recall in any detail, but I think that given that the ACBSB had been informed of these developments, and indeed ministers, then it didn't seem as if that was going to be a pivotal piece of information to give to them.
So those are the additional questions I'm proposing to ask from those put forward on behalf of core participants. I don't think Mr. Canavan's own representatives have any questions. No. Do you have any questions for Mr. Canavan?
No, I don't. Thank you.
Mr. Canavan, is there anything further that you would wish to add?
No.
Well, it remains for me to thank you very much, Mr. Canavan, for coming and telling us, giving us clarity as to the matters in which you were involved and those in which you were not involved back in the late 80s, early 90s, and later on. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Tomorrow.
And tomorrow, sir, we have the evidence of Baroness Primarolo.
Baroness Primarolo tomorrow, 10 o'clock.